The strangest part was not pretending to be his boyfriend. The strangest part was realizing everyone else believed it before I did. The grand ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as hundreds of elegantly dressed guests filled the luxurious hotel with quiet conversations and warm laughter. Business executives, charity partners, journalists, and family friends moved from table to table, greeting one another with polished smiles. In the center of that beautiful crowd stood Adrian Hayes, the heir to one of the most respected hotel families in the country. Everyone seemed to know his name. Everyone wanted a few minutes of his attention. Yet while cameras flashed around us, Adrian reached for my hand as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. His fingers slipped gently between mine, and every conversation within a few feet suddenly seemed to pause. Curious eyes turned toward us. I could almost hear the silent questions forming before anyone dared ask them. Who was I? Why was I standing beside him? Why had the wealthy heir chosen someone nobody recognized? Adrian simply smiled, completely calm beneath the attention that would have overwhelmed anyone else. I tried to smile back, but my heart was pounding so loudly that I wondered if the guests standing nearest to us could actually hear it. If someone had told me only a few weeks earlier that I would be standing inside one of the finest hotels in the city pretending to be Adrian Hayes' boyfriend, I would have laughed until I lost my voice. Back then, we were nothing more than roommates sharing a small campus apartment a few blocks from the university. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was a senior majoring in marketing, balancing classes with evening shifts at a neighborhood coffee shop to help pay rent and cover everyday expenses. My life was simple. Morning lectures, homework, grocery shopping, laundry, and trying to keep our apartment clean enough that neither of us would trip over textbooks left on the floor. Adrian lived in the same apartment, yet his world felt completely different. Expensive suits occasionally appeared in our closet beside my hoodies. Chauffeured cars sometimes waited outside the building before family events. He rarely talked about his family, but every now and then his phone would ring late at night, and his expression would quietly change before he stepped onto the balcony to answer. Even then, he always returned with the same polite smile, pretending everything was fine. I never pushed for answers because roommates did not have to know every secret about each other. Looking back now, I wish I had asked more questions. Everything began on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just finished washing the dishes while Adrian sat at the kitchen counter staring silently at his phone. The apartment was unusually quiet until the screen lit up again. He answered immediately, listening without interrupting as his expression slowly became more serious with every passing second. After the call ended, he remained completely still for nearly a minute before finally looking at me. There was hesitation in his eyes, something I had never seen before. Then he took a slow breath and said the one sentence that changed both of our lives forever. Ethan, he said softly, I need to ask you for a favor that I cannot ask anyone else. For a moment, I thought Adrian was about to ask me to help him study for finals or cover his turn buying groceries. Instead, he remained standing beside the kitchen counter, his phone still resting in his hand as though the conversation he had just finished was refusing to let go of him. I had lived with Adrian for almost 8 months, and in all that time I had never seen him look uncertain. He was always calm, organized, and impossible to read. Tonight was different. You are starting to make me nervous, I joked, hoping to lighten the mood. A small smile appeared on his face before disappearing almost immediately. My family is hosting our annual hotel gala this weekend, he said quietly. I nodded. I already knew the event was important. Every year newspapers covered it, local charities attended, and business leaders from across the state gathered at one of the Hayes family's luxury hotels. Sounds like a big night, I replied. It is. He looked down for a second before meeting my eyes again. This year my parents expect me to bring someone. I frowned. Someone? A boyfriend. The apartment fell silent. Outside our window, rain tapped softly against the glass while traffic drifted through the evening air several stories below. I waited for him to continue. My family has been asking questions for months, Adrian admitted. Every holiday. Every phone call. Every visit home. They keep assuming there is someone special in my life, and I never corrected them because it seemed easier at the time. I leaned against the kitchen island with my arms folded. So now they expect to meet him. He nodded once. Exactly. And you want me to pretend? Only for one weekend. I could not help laughing in disbelief. Adrian, your family owns one of the nicest hotel companies in the country. They have probably met celebrities and politicians. You really think I can walk into that world and convince everyone I belong there? Yes, he answered without hesitation. Why? I asked. Because you are the only person I trust. His answer caught me completely off guard. I searched his face, expecting him to smile and admit he was exaggerating, but he never did. You have plenty of friends, I said. Not like you think. He walked toward the living room before returning with a neatly folded garment bag. Inside hung a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. My tailor can make a few adjustments tomorrow morning, he explained. You already had this prepared? He looked slightly embarrassed. I hoped you would say yes. I stared at the tuxedo, then back at Adrian. You planned all of this before asking me? Only because I was afraid I would lose my courage if I waited any longer. His honesty made it impossible to dismiss the request as something casual. This was not simply about attending a glamorous event. Whatever pressure he had been carrying alone had finally become too heavy to hide. I let out a slow breath and looked around our small apartment, wondering how two roommates sharing takeout dinners and arguing over whose turn it was to wash dishes had somehow ended up standing at the edge of a weekend that was about to change everything. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined walking into a ballroom filled with people who had spent their entire lives surrounded by luxury while I was still wondering whether my favorite pair of dress shoes looked too worn. By morning, I had almost convinced myself to apologize and tell Adrian he needed to find someone else. Before I could say anything, he knocked gently on my bedroom door holding 2 cups of coffee. Good morning, he said with a smile that looked far more hopeful than confident. I figured you might need this. I accepted the cup and laughed quietly. You are trying to improve your chances. Maybe a little. We spent the morning at a tailor's studio near downtown where the tuxedo was adjusted to fit perfectly. The staff greeted Adrian by name, but what surprised me most was the way he introduced me. This is Ethan, he said warmly. He is important to me. There was no hesitation in his voice. No awkwardness. Those simple words lingered in my thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. Early Saturday, a black luxury sedan arrived outside our apartment building. I stared at it through the window before looking back at Adrian. This is really happening. He smiled gently. Only if you are still comfortable going. I took a slow breath before nodding. I promised I would help. The drive to the hotel took less than 30 minutes, but it felt much longer. As the city skyline disappeared behind us, an elegant waterfront hotel came into view. Tall glass windows reflected the afternoon sun while fountains danced across the entrance plaza. Employees welcomed arriving guests with practiced smiles, and luxury cars lined the circular driveway one after another. I had never seen anything like it outside of movies. Adrian noticed my expression and quietly leaned closer. You do not have to impress anyone, he said. Just be yourself. That sounds easier than it feels. Trust me, he replied. The person I wanted here is exactly who you already are. Those words eased my nerves more than he probably realized. Inside the hotel, everything seemed carefully designed to leave a lasting impression. Fresh flowers filled the lobby, a grand piano played softly near the entrance, and staff members greeted Adrian with genuine respect rather than fear. He thanked every employee by name, asking about their families or congratulating them on recent achievements. Watching those interactions changed the way I saw him. He was not respected simply because of his last name. He had earned it through kindness. Before we reached the ballroom, Adrian stopped near a quiet hallway overlooking the indoor garden. He looked at me with an expression that mixed gratitude and nervousness in equal measure. "There is one more thing," he said softly. "Once we walk through those doors, my family is going to believe we have been together for months." I smiled nervously. "Then I guess we should start acting like we know each other pretty well." Adrian laughed, and for the first time since this entire arrangement began, the tension in his shoulders finally disappeared. Then he gently reached for my hand, and together we walked toward the ballroom where both of our lives were about to change in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The moment we stepped into the ballroom, I understood why Adrian had looked so nervous before we walked through those doors. Every detail reflected generations of success. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the ceiling, fresh white flowers decorated every table, and a live orchestra filled the room with elegant music. Guests dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns moved gracefully through the crowd while photographers captured every important arrival. The atmosphere was beautiful, but it also carried a quiet pressure that settled over my shoulders the instant people recognized Adrian. Conversations paused for a heartbeat before smiles appeared across the room. Family friends approached first, followed by business partners and longtime employees who welcomed him warmly. What surprised me was how naturally Adrian introduced me to every single person. "This is Ethan," he would say with an easy smile. "I have been looking forward to introducing him." There was never the slightest hesitation in his voice. The confidence in his words made our arrangement sound completely believable, and before long I found myself relaxing enough to smile naturally instead of worrying about every sentence I spoke. Adrian's parents greeted us near the center of the ballroom. His mother embraced him warmly before turning toward me with kind eyes. "So you are the young man we have heard so much about," she said. I glanced at Adrian for the briefest second, wondering exactly what stories he had been telling his family. Before I could become embarrassed, his father stepped forward with a welcoming handshake. "Anyone important to our son is welcome here," he said sincerely. The warmth in his voice caught me completely off guard. I had expected difficult questions and suspicious looks. Instead, I found genuine hospitality. Throughout dinner, I quietly observed Adrian with his family and the hotel staff. The polished confidence everyone admired never disappeared, but I began noticing small details hidden beneath it. Every few minutes someone asked him about the future of the company, upcoming expansion plans, investment decisions, or when he intended to begin working full-time after graduation. He answered every question politely, yet each response seemed to leave another invisible weight resting on his shoulders. During a short break between speeches, we stepped onto a quiet terrace overlooking the hotel's gardens. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers while the sounds of the ballroom faded behind us. Adrian leaned lightly against the railing and let out a slow breath he had probably been holding for hours. "You are doing great," he said with a grateful smile. I laughed softly. "I think you are the one carrying this entire evening." He shook his head. "You have no idea how much easier this feels because you are here." I looked at him carefully. "You smile for everyone inside, but this is the first real smile I have seen all night." He stared at me in surprise before quietly laughing. "I guess you notice more than most people. Roommates tend to notice things." He lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "Most people only see the family name, the hotel, and everything that comes with it." His voice became almost a whisper. "Very few people ever ask whether I actually wanted any of it." Standing there beneath the soft lights overlooking the gardens, I realized the confident air everyone admired had been carrying a loneliness far greater than I had ever imagined, and somehow, without realizing it, I had already started caring far more than our simple agreement was ever supposed to allow. The evening continued with elegant speeches, charity presentations, and endless conversations that seemed to blend together beneath the warm glow of the ballroom lights. Little by little, I stopped worrying about saying the wrong thing and simply focused on staying beside Adrian. Every time another guest approached us, he introduced me with the same quiet confidence that made our relationship feel completely natural. I almost forgot we were pretending until someone unexpectedly reminded me. During the dessert reception, a young hotel executive named Daniel Walker joined our conversation. He greeted Adrian politely before turning toward me with an easy smile. "So you are Ethan," he said. "I have heard your name all evening, but I finally get to meet you." We talked for several minutes about college, graduation, and marketing careers. Daniel had graduated from the same university a few years earlier, and the conversation flowed easily. He even recommended a few companies that hired recent graduates and offered to introduce me to one of his former colleagues after the gala. I genuinely appreciated the kindness. While Daniel and I continued talking, I noticed Adrian becoming unusually quiet. He still smiled whenever someone addressed him, but he answered with shorter sentences than before. When Daniel jokingly suggested we exchange contact information over coffee sometime after graduation, I caught Adrian looking away toward the ballroom windows. His expression remained perfectly polite, yet something in his eyes had changed. A few minutes later, another guest called Daniel across the room, ending the conversation. As soon as he walked away, Adrian reached for a glass of sparkling water without saying a word. We stood together in comfortable silence until I finally smiled. "You have been awfully quiet." He glanced at me with an innocent expression. "Have I?" "You definitely have." He laughed softly but avoided my eyes. "Maybe I am just tired." I folded my arms. "That is not the real reason." He stared into his glass for several long seconds before letting out a quiet sigh. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" "Of course." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. "When Daniel asked you to coffee, I realized I did not like the idea as much as I thought I would." I blinked in surprise. "Why?" He gave a small, helpless smile. "Because I kept wondering what would happen after this weekend if someone else became the person you smiled at every morning instead of me." The honesty in his voice caught me completely off guard. I searched for the right response, but no words came. We had agreed this arrangement would end after the gala. Neither of us was supposed to become emotionally invested. Yet standing there beneath the crystal lights, I realized those simple rules no longer matched the quiet reality growing between us. Adrian looked down for a moment before speaking again. "Forget I said that," he murmured. "It was unfair." I slowly shook my head. "No," I answered honestly. "It was probably the most honest thing either of us has said all weekend." He looked at me with quiet surprise, and although neither of us spoke another word, the silence between us no longer felt like part of a performance. For the first time since this unusual journey began, pretending had become the hardest thing either of us had to do. When the gala finally came to an end, I expected Adrian to return home with the same composed smile he had worn all evening. Instead, after thanking the last few guests and saying good night to his parents, he quietly asked if I wanted to see one more place before we left. I nodded without asking any questions. Rather than heading toward the hotel entrance, he led me through a private hallway that most guests never noticed. We passed elegant conference rooms, busy kitchens where chefs were finishing the last of the evening's work, and employees who greeted Adrian with warm smiles instead of formal bows. He knew every person's name. He stopped to thank the servers for staying late, congratulated a young manager on her first successful gala, and even helped an elderly maintenance supervisor carry a small box across the hallway despite his expensive tuxedo. Watching him interact with everyone around him made me realize that the kindness I had seen at school was not an act. It was simply who he had always been. Eventually we reached a private elevator that carried us to the rooftop. The city stretched endlessly beneath us, glowing with thousands of lights reflecting across the river. A cool breeze carried away the noise of the ballroom until the entire world seemed strangely peaceful. Adrian rested his hands against the railing and looked out over the skyline for a long time before speaking. "When I was a kid," he said quietly, "my father used to bring me up here after every gala. I waited patiently. He would point toward the city and remind me that one day everything our family built would become my responsibility." He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. At first I thought it sounded exciting. As I grew older, it started feeling heavier every year. I turned toward him. "Have you ever told your parents that?" He slowly shook his head. "They sacrificed too much building this company. I never wanted them to think I was ungrateful." The wind gently lifted a strand of his hair as he continued looking across the skyline. "Everyone assumes I have a perfect life because of my last name, but sometimes it feels like every decision has already been made before I even have a chance to think." I leaned beside him against the railing. "You do not seem trapped when we are back at our apartment." He laughed softly. "That is because I am not." He looked at me with quiet sincerity. "Our apartment is tiny. The furniture does not match. We argue about whose turn it is to buy groceries. You leave textbooks on the couch, and I complain about it every week." I smiled. "You complain every single week." "Exactly," he said, laughing again. "And somehow those ordinary moments have become the only place where I do not feel like I have to perform for anyone." His expression gradually became more serious. "When I am with you, I am not the heir to a hotel company. I am just Adrian." Hearing those words made something inside me shift. I had agreed to spend one weekend pretending to help my roommate through a difficult family event, yet standing beside him beneath the quiet night sky, I realized the greatest gift either of us had received was not the success of our performance. It was discovering a place where both of us could finally breathe without pretending to be anyone else. The drive back to campus the next morning felt quieter than the trip to the hotel. Sunlight poured through the car windows while the city slowly gave way to familiar streets, coffee shops, and the apartment buildings surrounding the university. Adrian kept both hands on the steering wheel, occasionally humming along with the soft music playing through the speakers, but I could tell his mind was somewhere else. Mine was too. Neither of us mentioned the conversation we had shared on the rooftop. Somehow it felt too important to rush. When we finally carried our overnight bags back into our apartment, everything looked exactly the same as when we had left. My textbooks were still stacked across the dining table, his neatly labeled folders rested beside the television, and a half-finished grocery list remained attached to the refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a coffee cup. Ordinary life had returned, but neither of us felt quite the same. Classes resumed on Monday, and within a few days it almost seemed as though the weekend had been a dream. We slipped back into our familiar routine of early lectures, shared dinners, and late-night study sessions. The only difference was that silence between us no longer felt empty. It carried unspoken thoughts that both of us seemed to understand without explanation. One evening, after we finished reviewing presentations for graduation week, Adrian closed his laptop and looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded immediately. He stood by the living room window for several seconds before turning toward me. "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." My heartbeat quickened. "What is it?" He smiled nervously, something I had never seen him do before. "Do you remember? Move-in day at the beginning of senior year?" "Of course," I answered. "I thought the housing office randomly assigned us as roommates." Adrian slowly shook his head. "It was not random." I stared at him, unsure whether I had heard correctly. "What do you mean?" He let out a quiet breath before continuing. "I requested the room change." My mind went completely blank. "You requested to live with me?" "Yes." I searched his face, hoping for some explanation that would make sense. Instead, he quietly laughed at himself. "I first noticed you during sophomore year at the campus coffee shop where you worked. You always remembered regular customers by name. You stayed late to help freshmen who looked lost. You treated everyone with the same kindness, whether they could help you or not. Every word left me more speechless than the last. When I found out we were both applying for the same apartment program during senior year, I asked the housing office if they could switch my assignment. I told myself I only wanted the chance to know you better. He looked down with an embarrassed smile. The fake boyfriend idea was never the beginning of this story. It was simply the excuse I finally found when I realized graduation was getting closer and I was running out of time. I could only stare at him as every thoughtful moment from the past year rearranged itself inside my memory. The late-night conversations, the coffee waiting on busy mornings, the quiet concern whenever I looked exhausted, none of it had happened by chance. Long before I ever thought Adrian had chosen me for one impossible weekend, he had already been quietly choosing me every single day. Adrian's confession stayed with me for days. No matter how hard I tried to focus on graduation assignments or job applications, my thoughts always returned to the same realization. Everything I believed had happened by coincidence had actually begun long before I ever noticed. The morning coffee waiting on the kitchen counter, the extra sandwich he always brought home when I skipped lunch, the way he somehow knew exactly when I needed encouragement before an important presentation, none of those moments had been random. They had all been quiet choices made by someone who never expected anything in return. Graduation week arrived faster than either of us expected. Students packed their apartments, families filled the campus, and everyone seemed busy preparing for the next chapter of life. Our apartment slowly became a maze of moving boxes, folded clothes, and stacks of books waiting to be donated or packed away. Every ordinary task carried an uncomfortable reminder that our time as roommates was almost over. One evening, after we finished sealing another cardboard box, Adrian walked over to the dining table and placed a small envelope in front of me. I looked up in confusion. "What is this?" He smiled gently. "The ending." I opened the envelope and immediately recognized the folded paper inside. It was the same handwritten agreement we had created before attending the hotel gala. At the bottom were the simple rules we had promised to follow, including the line that either of us could end the arrangement at any time. Adrian quietly pulled a pen from his pocket, crossed through the title with one smooth line, and folded the paper again. "The agreement is over," he said softly. "It served its purpose." I looked at him without speaking. He took a slow breath before continuing. "Everything after this belongs to you. If you decide that we should only remember the gala as one good weekend between roommates, I will respect that. If you want us to go back to being friends, I will be grateful for every moment we shared. I am not going to ask you for anything else." There was no sadness in his voice, only quiet sincerity. Somehow that made his words even more difficult to hear. "You are not going to try to change my mind?" I asked. Adrian slowly shook his head. "No, why?" He smiled with the same warmth that had slowly become my favorite expression. "Because if I have learned anything from loving you, it is that real feelings should never become another obligation. I never wanted you to stay because of a promise, a favor, or guilt. I only wanted the chance for you to choose freely." Those words settled into the silence between us. He slipped the folded agreement back into the envelope, placed it gently on the table, and picked up another moving box as though the conversation had already ended. I watched him quietly organizing books and wrapping picture frames in newspaper, pretending everything was normal while preparing himself to lose the person he loved. In that moment I understood something that changed everything. The bravest thing Adrian had ever done was not asking me to pretend to be his boyfriend. It was loving me enough to let me walk away if that was what would truly make me happy, and suddenly the only thing harder than saying goodbye was imagining a future where I actually did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The apartment felt strangely quiet, filled only with the soft sound of packing tape and the distant traffic drifting through the open window. Adrian continued organizing another box as though our conversation had already reached its ending, giving me every opportunity to leave without another word. That was exactly what made everything suddenly clear. From the very beginning, he had never tried to control my decision. He had simply hoped I would one day make it on my own. I looked at the envelope still resting on the dining table. Inside was the agreement that had started everything. A few weeks earlier, those pages had represented nothing more than a temporary arrangement between two roommates. Now they felt like the first chapter of a story neither of us had expected to write. I picked up the envelope, walked toward Adrian, and gently placed it back into his hands. He looked at me with quiet confusion. "I think you should keep this," I said softly. "Why?" he asked. I smiled before answering. "Because it reminds us where we started, not where we ended." He lowered his eyes to the folded paper, saying nothing. I took one slow breath before continuing. "You told me that real feelings should never become an obligation." He nodded once. "I meant every word." "Then I want you to know that what I am about to say is not because of a promise, a favor, or the gala." He slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. "It is because somewhere between sharing grocery lists, arguing over dirty dishes, late-night study sessions, and one unforgettable weekend at your family's hotel, I stopped pretending to." For the first time since I had known him, Adrian looked completely speechless. I laughed quietly. "You spent all this time believing you were the only one making quiet choices." I reached into the kitchen cabinet and pulled out the coffee mug he always used every morning before class. "I started waking up earlier just so your coffee would already be ready when you came into the kitchen." Then I pointed toward the bookshelf where his favorite business magazines had been carefully arranged. "I reorganized those because I knew you could never find anything after you finished studying." Finally, I smiled at the apartment around us. This place stopped feeling like a shared apartment a long time ago. It started feeling like home because you were here. Adrian let out a small laugh that sounded dangerously close to tears. "Ethan," I stepped closer and gently took his hand, not because anyone was watching, not because we needed to convince another room full of strangers, but because it was exactly what I wanted to do. "The agreement ended," I said. "But I do not want our story to end with it." Our fingers intertwined naturally, just as they had during the gala, except this time there were no expectations and no audience waiting to judge us. A week later, we crossed the graduation stage together beneath a bright spring sky surrounded by cheering families and excited classmates. After the ceremony, Adrian looked at me with the same warm smile that had first made me curious months earlier. "Ready for whatever comes next?" he asked. I smiled, held his hand a little tighter, and answered with complete certainty. "I have been ready since the day my roommate trusted me with his heart, and I finally found the courage to give him mine."